Good afternoon and welcome to our Douglas County Racial and Ethnic Disparities, also known as RED virtual conference. My name is LaDonna Jones Dunlap and I am one of the co-chairs of the Racial and Ethnic Disparities Subcommittee. Before we get started, I'd like to give a special thank you to the Separate Juvenile Court of Douglas County, Nebraska, the Honorable Vernon Daniels, CEO and President of the Urban League of Nebraska, Mr. Thomas Warren Sr., and Douglas County Commissioner Chris Rogers. These individuals provide unwavering support for our RED efforts. An additional thank you to the Nebraska Juvenile Justice Association for making this virtual platform possible. Before we get started, we'd like to put up a survey just to see who's in the room with us today. The RED team always appreciates you joining us and taking the time over your lunch hour to hear what the RED team has put together as far as a presentation. We got a survey, yeah. So a few housekeeping items. All participants have been placed on mute. If you have a question for our presenter, please enter it into the chat box. We will monitor questions as they come in and get to as many as time permits. For purposes of CEUs, if you are viewing this presentation in a room with others, please make sure to type your name and email address into the chat box to receive your certificate. Certificates will be mailed out this week. As a reminder, at the end of this presentation, during the closing remarks, we will put up a survey asking you a few questions about the presentation. Your input is valuable to us and we thank you in advance for completing it. Now I will turn it over to Rodney Evans, the other RED co-chair. Rodney, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Apologize. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Rodney Evans. I am one of the Racial and Ethnic Disparities co-chairs. I have the distinct pleasure today to introduce our presenter. Our presenter today, he was born here in Nebraska, born in Hastings, Nebraska. However, he grew up in North Omaha and has worked 25 years with Catholic Charities. He is currently the Racial and Ethnic Disparities Coordinator for Douglas County. He served 2 years in the Peace Corps in the Republic of Botswana, where he met and married his wife of 42 years. It is my great pleasure to introduce my friend, Mr. Aljamal Rashad Byndon.
Good. Thank you. Appreciate that, Rodney. So what I'm going to do today is I want to start off by talking a little bit about issues related to racial and ethnic disparities and justice for our youth. I did a previous presentation of this at one of our conferences here in Nebraska. And so what I'm going to do is I want to kind of go through some slides and have a conversation, but more than anything, I want us to challenge us about many of the paradigms and issues that I've confronted or addressed or dealt with in Douglas County in our judicial system. This information is available for you after the presentation, obviously, and we can talk more about it. So I'm going to kind of go through the slides and kind of use that as a foundation of where we're going to move from here. Let me make sure I got my slides going forward. Okay, some of the disclaimers I will start off with saying we're racial experts in many areas, and also one of the things we want to talk about is equity is a very important issue. You have heard in many different situations, people say it's not about us, without us. I heard that predominantly in the social work field, and then in the juvenile justice field, I've heard leaders, community members talk about those who are closer to the problem are closer to the solution. And one of the disclaimers I often talk about, particularly when you talk about race issues and RED issues, is we don't have to get hostile or negative or defensive when we're talking about some of the issues that has been confronting our society for many years, and particularly in Nebraska. We're going to look a little bit at some of the data. Some of the data is beyond my data curve, but I borrowed it from different data geeks and people who are experts in the area. And also what we want to do is have this conversation start about RED for folks who have not really addressed this. We will also hopefully come with some potential solutions and causes, and I would throw mines out there. But again, one of the things that is extremely important is that I think we all can bring solutions to how we can address RED in our particular jurisdiction or within our county or within our city or wherever. And also, we want to talk about next steps. Too often, you have people who talk about racial ethnic disparities in the juvenile justice system. They may come up with the problem, but they may not be able to come up with how do you implement it. And so we want to talk a little bit about that. And then the most important one is, can the victims define reality in an oppressive system? So oftentimes we have professionals, we have individuals who work in different areas talking about it, but oftentimes we don't have the very people who've been lived experiences in those respective institutions, or those who what we might call credible messengers. My job or my position was funded through the Office of JJDP, which is often known as the Office of Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Program. It's basically a federal program that goes to the state. And in Nebraska, Douglas County was able to apply about 3 years ago and got the funds. It used to go to the state, and I understand the state is working on trying to get back into the fold of getting the statewide funds in that area. It used to be known as disproportionate minority contact. They changed it about a year or so ago to racial and ethnic disparities. And so you'll hear us use the word racial and ethnic disparities more so than DMC. And one of the key things I will indicate is the relative rate index. Now, again, it went away about a year ago, and now they're kind of bringing it back because it gives us a way to compare different jurisdictions throughout the country. And again, one of the problems that we face in our society is we really haven't addressed it in a really systematic manner. There are some places that are a little bit better than others, but hopefully we'll have some examples to talk about. And one of the lines I throw here is Black Lives Matter, Race Matters, Latino Lives Matters, Native American Lives Matters, Asian Matters, and then I had All Lives Matter. What's that all about? Again, the initial came out of the Black Lives Matter movement. And what we want to be sensitive to is we go to those who have the greatest needs and challenge and focus on them and not allow that concept to be hijacked by others. Now, one of the things that's probably the most important is we do have racial and ethnic disparities. We can all admit that. And the question I ask is, why me? My question is, why not me? In a sense, you want people who can speak truth to power and who, in a sense, can go straight up and deal with some of the issues that have kept us hijacked to some of these numbers that we should be able to deal with. And part of it goes with race and ethnic issues that are important to juvenile justice. We got to begin to talk more about that in order to change it. And the data speaks to us. Whether we ignore it or not, the data is still speaking to us. And what we can do is, for example, point to what are those examples in our jurisdiction that shows that we have some racial ethnic disparity problems. All you need to do is go into our DCYC, and you see the majority of the kids are Black and brown kids, or African Americans and Latinos. And again, one of the issues is, why is that? I have a colleague of mine who likes using the word reverse engineering. In other words, you go and you see the problem, and then you try to figure out the solution by looking at the end problem. And too often, we don't do that. And the other issue is that more and more people are starting to say, let's look at race, ethnic, gender, geography, and offense. Sometimes the place that you live in can have some impacts on how you get services and so on. So we want to, again, spend some time looking at that as one of those factors. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of the slides a little quicker than others because, again, we don't have a lot of time for interaction on some levels, but some of them I think are very important. And what it currently exists, as I said earlier, youth of color are overrepresented in Douglas County system. And this is not Douglas County unique, it's throughout the country. And basically, we're in the juvenile justice system. You all know that it's supposed to be restorative versus punitive, but you would never know that in some of the behaviors and data that is manifested in some of this information I will share. Again, one of the things that I've discovered in the paradigm shift is there are very few advocates who are able to challenge and bring this condition to the front. And I think one of the things that helped me to understand is when this position came in existence, put a great more spotlight on us in Douglas County to what are we doing and how are we handling it. A school resources office is a good example for me. And again, one of the things that you learned about some of my presentations, I cut to the chase quickly by saying school resource officers was one of the first contacts for some of the kids getting inside the system. And I know there was a school resource office conference or where someone went to do some work related to Georgetown. They came back, and there was also some folks who did some other research and work, and they were able to reduce those numbers by 50%. Now, when I asked for the exact numbers, I was not given the exact numbers and how they did that. But again, it's one of those things that by focusing upon the first contact in our school to prison pipeline, we're able to look at some of that. The challenge is that we need to stop treating young people as criminals in spite of knowing that brain development is different for them as a whole. We also know that community conversations are very important. And one of the things that I bring to the table and have worked on is being around folks who talk about race, prejudice, classism, and things that mitigate certain racial groups to certain negative situations. We have to almost start there in order to deal with that. And I'm a firm believer that the concept of not having a lot of beds in various places, meaning when they reduce the number of beds at DCYC or in these juvenile justice institutions, it forces us as a community or as a jurisdiction to be able to reduce those numbers by looking at alternative avenues for those young people. And one example is that I had a chance to go to a national conference in Seattle, Washington, and talk to some of those experts there, and they were able to do just that. That city is much bigger than Omaha, but one of the ways that they were able to do was put a great deal of wraparound services and other services in place to avoid putting young people in these institutions. So when I first started, one of the things that I had to do was start from ground level, zero. There are some folks who just don't have a clue about racial issues, and they sometimes are blind to some of these issues, and they are also blind to some of the challenges. And part of the reason is that you don't come in contact with the very people and those communities who are impacted by these numbers. One of the things that I often use the word is silo dances, where we all work in our respective jurisdiction areas, our professional areas or departments, but we don't interact as a community. And again, those communities that have worked together better, they tend to do better. And I use the metaphor of football team. The best football team oftentimes win when they operate as a team. Again, it's a team sport. And I think juvenile justice reform is the same metaphor in a sense. We have started some community conversations. We've in the process of developing more Zoom meetings because of the pandemic and COVID-19. But again, part of this goes back to how do we do some of these events? About a year ago, there was a great community forum on out of Omaha. And it was one of those issues that, that again got people to talking about how our juvenile justice system worked. There are some who disagree with some of the content of that video, but at the end of the day, it was a wonderful conversation where almost 200 people participated at First United Methodist Church. Again, not that I'm doing a plug for them, but some of the church and faith communities are also involved in how do you bring people together. And again, one of the things we've talked about as a RED committee, again, is how do we bring credible messengers and people who've been locked out or ignored or not utilized to help us reform our juvenile justice system. We must also look at policy issues. There's a number of bills in the legislative unicameral that we got to get into talk about. Now, I'm going to kind of just run through this a little bit. One of the side things is I've taught for a number of years, and I talk about white fragility. Those are some terms. Racism. We got to talk about racism. We cannot ignore that. Anti-racism, what does that mean? Race equity, community engagement, white privilege. There are a number of terms. Another term that came up a few years ago is cultural humility. So again, in order to address DMC or RED issues, you got to have some basic terms, and some of this is new to folks in our jurisdictions. So I will say in our jurisdiction of Douglas County, we'll focus on the first 5 areas. Again, arrest, referral, diversion, detention, petition charges, for delinquency finding. And those other 2 areas are 3 areas that we can work on, but we're able to vote on that and go forward in that area after the changes happened about a year or so ago. Example of the racial data that was shared with me, we're in public meetings. For the most part, I'm not a data person, not a data geek. In actual fact, I know how to use a calculator. But one of the things that I must give certain credibility to is a data analyst from Operation Youth Success provided me with some data that I was able to provide to our reporting process a couple of years ago. And some of the information I have is somewhat dated a little bit, but again, it illustrates the RED issues. The police department provided some data, but again, somewhat limited. And it's not easy to get data from other departments if there's no memorandum of understanding, or if we don't have the same kind of capacity that they have in Connecticut or other places where there are laws that, in a sense, force them to share data based on race. The JDAI coordinator has given me a number of reports and stuff that I've got from some of their meetings. And of course, all these reports are sent to the federal government just to show how we're working on trying to reduce these numbers. And there's been a number of editorial comments on racial issues related to juvenile justice, and those are also fair game for us to have this discussion. So one thing I want to point out, and we had a racial and ethnic disparity meeting this morning, RED meeting, and we talked about the risk assessment. And basically, the risk assessment is basically a tool that they use to figure out if a young person is going to be detained to extent, and we are still debating that. And one of the issues we have in our jurisdiction is, has it been validated and is it reliable? And again, that's one of the issues that we're wrestling with But what happens in the case of many young people of color, particularly African Americans, they've overridden the risk assessment, and these kids end up being locked up instead of being given other alternatives to detention. But again, reliability and validity are very important issues that we will be looking at down the road with our risk assessment instrument, because one of the things we don't want to do is have a young person who shouldn't be in institutions there means to be able to make that determination. They may not have other problems in the future. And I'm not going to go into all this, but again, this is basically how the relative rate index is defined. And again, what this does is says you compare the norms of white youth with kids of color, youth of color. And this is kind of like a graph that depicted in a very simplified version, how they arrive at it, use basic elementary math here. And this is how we're able to get the data that shows comparison analysis of kids of color as well as whites. And this is, again, something that can be very helpful as we start to compare across jurisdictions or communities and so on. For some community people, we may even look at percentages. And there are different ways of slicing and dicing the numbers so that we can have the conversation, because I think the most important process for us are the conversations. This is something that the Data Analyst did or provided, but basically it's a whole grid sheet, or at least a kind of a flow chart. I know that Shelley's working on some other, and Kim on some other flow charts, but then this was the flow chart that she showed. And basically what the comment that she made, and it made me understand, is that in order to get to the relative rate index, you have to look at all of the data and bring it together. And then each one is based upon the previous one. So it is required that you have to have a lot of the data together and not just bits and pieces that is deconstructed or defined by that relative department and so on. Again, a little bit more detail, but again, it's part of the slideshow of, again, comparing the youth of color with white youth, and that's how you're able to get to those numbers. And so, for example, I have another one that will show a little bit more in detail. But one example is that this shows that in our area in 2018, you have the white youth, you have the African American youth, and so on. You can see how they pair up in terms of the graph. And there's one I'm going to show that explains it a little bit better. But basically, when you compare them, you can say 2.8% higher than normal, or 1% is normal, is what the basic white numbers are. And then when you look at African Americans at 14.3, use that example, their numbers is 14 times higher in a sense. This is probably the most easiest of the ones that I can understand. Basically what they did is she put together the number of youth in Douglas County to 61,000. And then she got all youth, and then whites 35,000, and then African Americans 8,000. And what she said or showed in this thing is that if you look at those numbers, you can show in terms of where we have up and down in terms of how those numbers are compared. So, for example, 1.6 African Americans the African Americans are 5.4% higher than whites. And so again, the numbers illustrate that in a sense here. And she gave a little bit different example of this as we move on. See, I went backwards. So in other words, the number of arrests, for example, 531 of whites. For African Americans who make up a much smaller percent of the population, they are 614. And so this shows you there's a significant difference. Hispanics is 262, Asians 19, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islands, the numbers. Can you hear me here? Can you hear me?
We can hear you. We can't see you at the moment.
Wow. Okay. Didn't expect that to happen.
Your voice is what we need.
Okay. My video stopped. Okay, we good now?
Yes.
Yes, you're back now.
Okay, good. So one of the things that the numbers showed us is that when we look at these numbers, for the most part, they just show the disproportionality, and we have to begin to talk about that and not get defensive as we move forward. Now oh, there we go. So the other point is she also showed the arrest by zip code areas. And you can see in parts of our communities, there's a higher percentage of arrests in certain zip code areas, 68111, and so on. And again, this is what we need to focus on when we look in terms of reducing those numbers in our respective areas. So one of the things that I'm really concerned about is how do we have this conversation and we deal with the numbers in a real sense? And what I've discovered is that we're going to have some evaluations and dialogues on the evaluation. There was a time that I actually sat down with a couple of the data analysts, as well as some other folks from the county attorney's office. And we spent probably about a couple hours talking about what is reportable, what is out there, what can we use. And what we came to the conclusion is that we had some numbers that we agreed upon, but in each one of our areas, we defined a little bit different. And so we came up with a matrix of definitions and were able to go forward. And again, it was a one-time situation. And again, I think that's what most jurisdictions do, is that they have different silos. They define it differently in different areas. And so this is one of the things that we're really concerned about. Let me see. The other thing we're looking at is having community forums, having people talk about that, table talks. One of the things I had written in my plan originally was to have police officers, law enforcement, talk about what they experience with some of the community people, credible messengers, as well as people in the different silos. We have not been able to make that happen, but we still have that as something that may happen in the future. One of the points is getting the different contact points, as I talked to earlier, to define how it works in the area. When I was attending some of the RED meetings about a year or two ago, I remember there were a number of motions made on the floor, a number of requests for different silos or different departments to provide data, and that was not always provided. So they were not able to determine if they were going forward or backwards. But again, one of the things that we have to do is look at the data points. And one of the data points that have been very easy to pull across is secure detention or DCYC, but in the other areas have been somewhat problematic. Probation has also been pretty good with their data and so on. And there has been what we call data changes in our community, but again, not to the point that would help us reverse all the numbers on the levels we'd like to do. And one thing we have not looked at is the judicial system and the county attorney system on the level of data. There's some information out there. It's not easy to get to because, again, each jurisdiction or each department or each silo controls their data. And one of the things that we have that's pending in the unicamera is how do we get a data system that we can share across the state and across our jurisdiction to deal with that. Let me give you a quick example. I used here this incident cutting and the robbery situation. Probably a couple of years ago, there was a young man who actually lured somebody to a site and he robbed the person. I guess he may have had a gun involved, and he had some mental health issues, you name it. And at the end of the day, he got 20 years in prison. Everybody was shocked by that. And it came up in one of our racial and ethnic disparities meeting. It was an African American. There was another incident where it was a young white guy who actually cut a young co-ed woman's throat with a knife and so on. And he got like maybe a year or so, if that, or probation. Again, that illustrates the racial and ethnic disparities issues in our state. We oftentimes look at police, we look at some of these other silos, but we have not looked at the judges in a sense. And again, this is one of the reasons why we need to be able to get the data on, make sure that when we provide sentencing for young people, that it has some sense of equity in it. And again, that's one of the issues that we're looking at. Another thing I will say is academic studies. One of the things that I've discovered is that there's very few academic studies on racial and ethnic disparities. We have 2 criminal justice departments in this area. And if you look at the number of studies that come out of them, they're dismal, they're small. Ann Hobbs, who is a professor and also works at the Justice Institute, she was also provided a report in 2012 that talks about DMC. The Burns Institute, she did a study in 2010, and there's been some minor studies here or there, but nothing major. But we really need to have the academic community notch up their game to help us with this. And there is another study we have on the books that should be coming up this year from the Justice Institute that's out of California, Oakland. Antonio and Mrs. Davis is going to provide that for us. So what I'm concerned about is the codification of the legal and the dual justice system. How are we dealing with that? Is the juvenile justice system that reflects red a form of apartheid? I come out and say that straight up. And why do we tolerate that? Is it normal? Where are the advocates who advocate for justice? Why have we come this far and those numbers have been that way for so many years? And then do we have the inability of practitioners to name and claim it? These are questions that I raise. Some may bristle at them, but at the end of the day, the numbers should not look that way. Again, I understand that there may be a higher percentage of crime in certain areas and so on, but you shouldn't have a situation where people are triple and quadruple the numbers based on their racial population? And then do we have community voice and choice? Is that out there? Who participates, who's invited? One of the things that I'm kind of excited about is I think we're going to do more in the community and get more people involved and so on. And I'm going to stop here and then take some questions. But one of the things that for years we've had data exchange out at 84th and Center in Omaha. For those who may be statewide, that is not in the area where some of the highest levels or percentage of juvenile young people come from, are kids who are put in DC, YC, and so on. And one of the things we're going to look at is how do we move our data exchange information to other locations. A couple of years ago, we had a group that met at 30th and Ames Street at the local precinct office and had some community people talk to us about our Georgetown project. It was a wonderful exchange of people who understood the community and also who understood where we were coming from. So one of the goals is how do we make sure that when we talk about racial and ethnic disparities, the data, the information, we can take that out to the community and let them push back and have information that they can be better advocates, not only to us, but advocates for themselves and their families to challenge our red issues that exist in Douglas County. So I'm going to stop right there and take a pause and see if there's any questions, comments, feedback, because I know that I was probably talking a little fast, but want to get some feedback. And pushback, please. This is no pain, no gain. This is about us.
All right, Ajmal, yeah, you have a couple questions out there. I'm going to take this one first because it refers to one of the charts that you presented. Is the total of population at risk the total for that number of youth in the county per group on the chart before the zip codes?
Is the total number of people at risk in that zip code? The way I think she put it is she just put the total number of youth in that area. I don't think they were at risk. I think she just did the numbers and then she just went by the percentage who were inside the system. So I think she just did the general population, but I wouldn't say that they would be at risk. It was a kind of a raw number she threw out there, and then she just did a percentage by that way. And again, I want to use one of Shelley's comment. I'm not the data person as much as I'm the messenger. But again, this is why it's very important to work as a team. And her numbers, I guess, just reflected those numbers. And again, as she drilled down into the numbers, she was able to show that you had 5 times the number of kids of color in the system as compared to whites. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say the whites or African Americans or Hispanics are at risk as much as I would say those are the demographics. And one of the things that have been cited or shared many times in our systems is that we oftentimes look at those small numbers of people who are in systems and generalize it to the larger population, say, this is a major catastrophe, but the majority of kids are good kids, young people who are doing good work. But again, for the juvenile justice reform, we're focusing on those who make contact with the system.
Okay.
Other feedback, other reactions.
Please define white fragility and how it relates to juvenile justice.
Please define white fragility as it relates to juvenile justice. Okay. Yes. I like that. That's good. It reminds me of when you have a conversation about racism or prejudice or anything related to the challenges that people of color face, and we kind of clam up or we don't want to talk about it or we don't even want to use racialized terms. And I'll use another example. Again, one of the things that I'm known for is speaking my mind, and sometimes it gets me in hot water. But there is no excuse for me to sit in a room inside the city county building and there are 35 people talking about the criminal justice system. They're all white and the only person of color in the room. Now, again, that is not unique to Douglas County. That happens statewide. We have juvenile justice committees where there is not one person of color in the room. And when they do bring a person of color in the room, the person is somewhat muted or guarded about the conversation. I think one of the reasons why I was hired is because I bring this wealth of information of community engagement, talking about race issues. And white fragility means that as a white person, I'm afraid to confront some of these issues. I see that amongst professionals. And again, part of the thing that I allude to a little bit later, but I talk about is that when you go to law school in Nebraska, or you go into the criminal justice department in Nebraska, they really don't deal with race very well, particularly that elephant sitting on the table. So white fragility is a term that was coined by Robin DiAngelo to talk about why we as a society have a hard time dealing with race conversation. And I've translated a little bit to the juvenile justice system to say we have done that because when you look at the numbers using reverse engineering, we know that kids of all races do some of the same things, but invariably when those kids of color, they get treated much more harshly, and we don't acknowledge or talk about that, and that becomes a form of white fragility. And particularly who controls the narrative, who controls the dominant group. That's how that happens. Good question. Thank you. Appreciate that.
From your perspective as the racial and ethnic coordinator in Douglas County, Nebraska, number one, what are the barriers or challenges to reducing red in Douglas County? And number two, from your perspective, from a red coordinator's perspective, what are your thoughts on the Capitol attack in Washington, D.C. as it relates to race? And then there's a part three, but I'll let you do the first two.
I appreciate that. I'm getting up in age, so my memory is not like it used to be. But one of the biggest challenges, I think, is just building social capital and being able to communicate and not get defensive. And again, from time to time, there are things that I don't see well. And I say that, and the way that I'm able to see something is that someone has to explain it to me sometime in a different manner. So I would say one of the biggest challenges is getting us to sit in a room and make sure that we don't have segregated all white spaces when we're talking about people of color. And for even people of color, sometimes we need to be in other communities as in Native Americans, Latinos, Asians, and interacting with them. So the biggest challenge, I think, is building social capital and getting people who work in law enforcement. I'm not talking exclusively about police officers. I'm talking about county attorneys. I'm talking about people in public defenders. All of us need to be able to travel our area, our communities to serve families. I think one of the greatest baptismals that you get in working with families is going into their homes and being respectful with them and so on. And I think if more of us did that, it would make our system much better. There are professionals I've seen when I worked at Promise Ship and elsewhere who've never really been in North Omaha. Again, it's part of your job if you're going to serve that family, or if you're going to work in the judicial system, you work downtown oftentimes. But I don't want people to necessarily get on a bus and do a trolley ride like they do in some departments. I'm not going to call out education per se, but I want people to interact more. So that's one of the big challenges. Going back to the January the 6th thing, and I didn't know how much it affected me, but I was traumatized by it. I really was traumatized because I thought we had come a lot farther as a society. And one of the things that really bothered me about it is it gave a depiction of the duality of our justice system. You got people who did things that were unlawful, and they basically rationalized how they should be treated a certain way. I would even go as far as to challenge even the law enforcement folks who participated. Even now you see people pointing fingers at each other in the FBI and who know what, when, and so on. We as a society need to be much more astute to the historical legacies of slavery, Jim Crowism, and even our whole judicial system that has not always been fair. And I've been following lately some of the issues that happen in the criminal justice system for people who've been exonerated. Well, I think the same thing happens to young people where they have been accused of things they haven't done. One of the things that the video out of Omaha helped me to understand is that video depicted where the young person was not ultimately charged per se, but he was held in that system to make him tell on someone else, and he apparently did not capitulate to that. Again, that points to a system we need to deal with. When you're in a relationship with people and you're on equal levels with them and they can talk frank talk, you can clean situations up. I learned a great deal when I spent time in South Africa, how people are treated there racially. And I came back to Nebraska and I felt right at home. Again, I get to say that because that's my experiences. And I think we need to be very careful when we see situations not to look the other way. And we need to be sensitive to dealing with what happened nationally, because it does affect us locally. Because again, Omaha is a microcosm, or Douglas County, of the United States in terms of racial makeup. I've said that many, many times. So what we do here reflects oftentimes what happened on the national level.
The third part of that question is, what do you mean by a dual justice system?
I like that. A dual justice system is when you got 7% of the population, 5% of the population in Nebraska being people of color, and they can constitute maybe 35 or 40%, in systems. Let me give another point that I want to make, and I think it speaks to the notion of what I'm talking about. I was actually sitting in a meeting one time, and the police officer said in this meeting, before I arrest a person, I will let them clean out their pockets. And I says, what? are you serious? He said, well, it's going to be a lot more difficult for the paperwork if the person has, I assume, marijuana in their pocket or something, particularly if they committed some other infraction. And when a dual system, I didn't ask the officer at the time in front of other people, was it a Black youth or a white youth or a Hispanic youth or whatever? But all you gotta do is do some reverse engineering that, again, when you go upstream and you see a disproportionate number of people who've been marginalized for 450 years, something isn't fair. And again, I'm not saying if you do the crime, you don't have to do the time. What I'm saying is that if you have money and you have opportunities, you have connections, there are certain benefits you get, and that becomes a dual system. Again, one of the things that we need to be fair. And again, something is wrong with our justice system when you have a disproportionate number of people who may commit, again, the same crime, but they get different sentencings or else they get different treatment. That's what a dual system is. And you only have to do is just look at our history and look at our numbers just to know something's going on. Marijuana is a good example. Right now, we're talking about letting people out of jail and prisons related to marijuana because in some parts of our country, marijuana is not as severe as in other parts. You know, you go to Colorado and you got you a bag or whatever, and you come to Nebraska, you get treated differently. And so what I'm saying, that's a good example of the dual justice system. And I'm just saying, let's have that conversation. And if it's not dual, then how do the numbers get to be that way? And particularly if we do a little bit of history searching and look at what's going on in our country, we can see these examples that happened many years ago. And again, I would say it's still, a lot of it has not changed in terms of what's happening in our juvenile justice and criminal justice system. And that's the reason I think my job even exists.
This group is focused on RED as it relates to youth, but what efforts are being done to address RED as a whole, to include adults, poverty, health disparities, employment opportunities, et cetera?
Right. I have a friend named Paul who's oftentimes says we need to talk about reparations. We need to talk about the criminal justice system. And I remember when I first started my job, my supervisor says, "Oh, you're only going to be focusing on juveniles?" Well, again, that's what the fund is for. I was in another meeting and somebody says, "Why don't you focus on this issue?" Well, this is racial ethnic disparities funds. But I do think that you cannot deviate from some of those other issues. This is where I think it's very important to build coalitions of people and utilize some of those credible messengers who have spent some time in our criminal justice system. I made a mistake one time of calling the juvenile justice system, the criminal justice system, and a county attorney professional pointed out that no, juvenile justice is completely different than the criminal justice, meaning adults. We need to distinguish the differences in a certain way. But at the same time, I do know that many of the same parallel problems or issues are one and the same. But again, as that my sister was telling me a story years ago, she was speeding in Nebraska and a state trooper pulled her aside and gave her a ticket, and she made a comment, says, "What about that person in front of me? They were also speeding." And the state trooper said, "I can only stop one person at a time." Well, again, it's the same way in this area. We have specialty areas, and hopefully if we're talking to each other, we can have crossover and synthesize some of the skill learning from different areas to help us not only in the criminal justice, but the juvenile justice system. I'm a firm believer, and particularly when there's so few of us doing the work of the many, that we don't have time to sit and argue. We have to come together and break bread in a sense and try to solve our issues. And again, I go use the metaphor of the football team or a baseball team. When we do this stuff collective, we can change the numbers. And I don't think that Seattle has anything over Omaha. I just think that when you bring some of the brightest minds in the room, you can't help but get great solutions.
Do you know if there are studies that show how access to quality legal representation impacts these outcomes?
You know, I think there's some stuff out there on and I haven't really ran into any studies myself, but I think that would be one of those things we probably need to pursue. I know that we've been so focused on getting the data and communicating among ourselves, we haven't focused on the academic studies as well as the excellent legal representation. Years ago, I had a person who talked to me about guardian ad litem and some of the lawyers who were working with juveniles and so on, and was saying they were not the best ones in some areas. They actually observed where they actually come to the system and hadn't any met their clients, and yet they were going to go to court and defend them. So I only know some of these stories secondhand from people who work directly with youth inside these institutions, but I do know that if you got some decent money, there's a greater chance you can get a little bit better justice than if you don't have the money. Again, I know people in government positions will challenge that concept, but again, how do you challenge it if there's no baseline of numbers to say, this is what we did, this is what our success rate is, and so on? I just think we got to do a better job of just bringing these folks to the table and say, what is the data that show that you are one of the best public defenders or county attorneys or whatever? And if we don't have the data, and I think there's currently someone is proposing legislation in Nebraska to get more data to show how good we are. I've asked in a couple of meetings for some data from the public defender's office, and I didn't get it. I asked for some other information, didn't get it. Again, some of it's beyond my bell curve, but again, folks feel that they own the data. And I'm not talking about individual data on a youth, so I'm talking about the collective data where we talk about racial issues. But all I'm going to do is reverse engineer and say that if you got 80 to 90% of the kids in DCYC are African Americans, something is not passing the smell test.
The last question I have in this group is, in reviewing the juveniles, where are we with the conversation of truancy and the legal charges? Have they addressed it not resulting in criminal offenses on the youth record?
Wow, there is a bill, I think Kim talked about it this morning. They're talking about the truancy bill, that they're trying to reduce that. I knew the Georgetown group is in the process of putting together some information sessions, but more than that, before they get there, they got to work with some of the key providers or stakeholders on that, but we're still working on that. But it is a major issue. We shouldn't have truancy treated in the juvenile justice system and the way it's practiced now in Nebraska. Because we were somewhat surprised when we went to Georgetown that we were, they had some numbers that were somewhat not as accurate as they could be, but we do have a higher percentage of kids than we should have in that. So we're working on it, but again, you can only do so much within a short period of time, but we're working on it.
Okay, and that was the last one that we have right now. So
good. Well, okay, let me finish up a little bit. I appreciate it. Boy, we got an active group here. So one of the things that I propose and I talk about in order to reverse the duality in 2021 is for the Douglas County Attorney to hire more attorneys of color and develop racial and ethnic disparity reports and so on. Connecticut and Florida has a law that requires them to report that out. Again, how do you know if you're good, bad, or indifferent if you don't have the data to illustrate that? And I'm going to again say that something is wrong upstream. Hold data meetings. We've had data meetings for a while, but what I'm going to argue is that how do you bring external people to those data meetings, and how do you make these data meetings public? And then for some of us who are not data geeks or are very good at it, how do you translate what they're saying so the average person can advocate or get involved in social justice to reverse some of these numbers if they don't know what we're talking about? And so I'm going to say bring more grassroots folks in, external experts, and people who are not as defensive with the data. Again, we have to be not defensive about the data because the data is the data. We must have quality indicators. Scholars work on quality indicators. Each one of those areas should have some kind of report. And then as we talk from time to time, and I came out of different fields of whether it be the food pantry, child welfare, you name it, one of the things you learn is that you almost need a code book to understand what happens with the juvenile justice, criminal justice system. We need to use we need to use the same kind of a code book or languages that's understood to the common person when we're describing some of those areas and incidents. The other thing I'm concerned about is our law schools. Again, I don't say this to be disrespectful, but I don't think they really provide any diversity in racial ethnic education in law schools. I actually went to a professor's class one time and talked, but the class was so different. I don't even know how to talk about it, but how do you go through law school? How do you go through 4 years of university and never have a course to deal with some of the social political issues related to race, ethnicity in our society? And we also need to help teach judges and lawyers. I don't talk about that milquetoast culture diversity course that just makes us all walk out and feel good. I'm talking about where people are saying some very strong statements about what our system is like and how do we deal with these issues. Again, it goes back to, if we're going to do that, we need to have this on our books. As a private citizen, I wrote letters to some of the law deans and so on, and locally didn't really respond. I mean, I find it somewhat embarrassing that in 2021 or even before, we really don't have a rigor type of a strong course that helps us to understand some of these issues that we're talking about today. And of course, cultural humility, which is somewhat an oxymoron for some people. But how do we learn about culture? We learn from other people. We are not the experts on their culture. And in criminal justice system, I've never spent any time in these institutions like jail and prison, but wouldn't it be better for someone who've actually experienced that to help us understand how that system works? Again, I'm not saying go upstream and deal with each and every person on this, but I'm just saying, how do we, again, approach these? One of the recommendations that I make, and I say very strongly, is I don't even know how to do the job if we can't talk about race and race equity. I mean, why are we even talking if we don't even go upstream and deal with it straight up? We must create positions similar to unbud's positions that address our shortcomings. You know, I cannot begin to tell you the number of people who have pushed back at me when all I did was pointed out reality. Again, you need an unbud's position, ombudsman, whoever, but someone who can talk about the racial disparities. We need to have meetings in various parts of our community. We have to, in the neighborhoods where those children come from. And we cannot use terms like we're going to help the youth without talking about the total family, particularly the fathers. It's fathers. And we do that oftentimes, even fathers who are trying to be participatory in helping their young people. We got to do a better job. Excuse me. And we also must develop community profiles. I keep coming back to there are a number of people who have navigated our system in Nebraska. Where are they at? They should be first at our tables. We should be dealing with them. When I went to Baltimore to a national conference dealing with racial and ethnic disparities, I was impressed with some of the people I met who were leaders and who had actually spent time in the system as young people. We got people like that in Nebraska. I'm a firm believer that that African proverb that says the best coal or the best firewood you find within the village that you visit. We got a lot of diamonds in the rough here in Nebraska. We need to be utilizing them a lot more. I really don't necessarily need folks to come in and tell me things that we already know. Because at the end of the day, we're going to have to solve these problems by ourselves anyway. Supreme Court has commission on the children in courts. And again, they created some task force and groups and so on to look at some of these issues, guardian ad litem and so on, tribal programs, B2 GAP program. And that deals with, again, kids who are aging out of the system and need help to get them to go forward. We also need to work with school resource officers. Again, they get some training, but they also need more training to make sure that they're not, as they call, fishing inside the school buildings for kids who otherwise wouldn't get in trouble if they was out on the streets. Healthcare is a big issue, input. How does that affect many of our young people? What are we dealing with? Mental health issues? Are we talking about that? We need to deal with that. The YRTCs is, again, another problem that we face. And I've noticed some of that from the Children's Commission. High percentage of those are kids. And I also found out some of them are the kids with misdemeanors. I found out some of them there should not even be there because we didn't have other places to put them. Again, we must have attorneys that represent those kids in a certain fashion. Now, this is reverse engineering here, but these are numbers from the Nebraska Penal Institution. I got this from Doug, the Inspector General. But look at the numbers. African Americans only about what? 5-6% of the population. 7, in Omaha, they're around 13%, 14, same as Hispanics, but statewide, much smaller numbers. How do these numbers get that way? Again, this is outside of our jurisdiction or outside of our bell curve because these are the criminal justice numbers. But if they could produce these numbers and, again, address them or try to address them, we should also have the same kind of situation. So anyway, we're getting close to the end, and I'm conscious of time. What are the factors that lead to RAD and so on? So I want to ask that earlier. Are there anything specific to Douglas County? Should we be asking that questions of ourselves every day? If the city, state, and community have a certain percent of people of color in certain situations, should it mirror their population? Those are questions. If so, what are we doing to make the changes like that? And why is it difficult for someone to talk about white fragility? I crossed that out, or that person maybe crossed it out. We crossed it out like, oh, we don't want to talk about it. Racism, institutional racism. The code word has been implicit bias. Give me a break. Implicit bias means we don't know about it. It's an important concept, but it's not the only tool in our toolkit. We must talk about red issues, classism, white privilege, poverty, you name it. And then what can we point to as real change? How is it measured? I cannot begin to tell you the meetings I've sat in where people do the self-promotion dance about we've had changes, but the numbers are still the same. Again, you can count the numbers longitudinal in the long term in some areas, but I'm talking about here and now. What are we dealing with here and now? And if it's beyond that bell curve, let's talk about that. What it was noted by me and our community forums that we sometimes do patronizing self-promotions of the status quo. And we oftentimes don't do it in a concerted manner. We have to, again, to challenge ourselves and bring people into our circles who are be critical. I call them constructive, critical people who we need to make us better. What's that expression? No pain, no gain. Little side note. I wanted to lose weight one year. So I bought a membership in the gym. I never went for the whole year. And, I thought by buying that membership would make me lose weight, but I never went to the gym. How does that work out? Then I had another excuse the following year. I was going to make people think that I lost weight. So I went and got these suit jackets like 2 or 3 sizes bigger, and I started wearing them. People say, man, you lost a lot of weight. Oh, well, yeah, I really appreciate you saying that. Well, again, it was my facade of getting the suit jacket. It was a little bit bigger than our more normal size. We do that mentality in many of our institutions where we put these facades out there and we don't deal with them. Catherine Marvier was a source of most of the data that I had here earlier. And some of it, like I said, was shared in my annual report a while back. I'm open to feedback, criticism, how to reduce those numbers. What can we do? And again, it's not about I, it's about we. And some of this work is already in our strategic plan, and we do have a greater sense for community engagement. I'm very grateful for the input from the RED committee and folks who have kind of stepped up even more so in the last year or so to help out there. And there is a data person who works down for the Douglas County juvenile justice system to help deconstruct the data and make it so that it can be easier for the public consumption. And the strategic plan is already out there where they're working on it, and so I'm kind of excited about that. But again, these are kind of roadmaps that help us to go forward, and it can make this work a lot easier for all of us. And one of the things that I will argue, and again, I think other people have argued the same point, Shelley made the point very well in the meeting this morning, it's not about us. It's about our children, it's about our grandchildren, it's about those who are not yet born. It's the name of an African novel or book. It is about those who are not yet born, and W. Du Bois talks about that. Sometime we will do things, and those people who are not yet born may not even know that we've done it. But that's what we need to be about if we're going to change these situations. So I'm going to stop right there. I know we got about 8 minutes or so. And any other feedback and so on. Bam. We got 65 people on this call. Check that out, man. All right, we got to, okay, wait, stop it, Jamal. Stop being silly. Just, be serious. Any other questions? Anything else out there?
I don't have any new ones in.
Well, I tell you, I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. It's always a pleasure to be able to chit chat and share things. And one of the things I learned from my many years of serving people and being of service to other folks is it's always about others. As Ralph Abernathy said, who was a great friend of Martin Luther King, it is not about the number of servants we have, it's about the people who we serve. And I think that's what this is about for many of us. We come to this work as a labor of love because, again, we don't get a lot of money. That's obvious. But we don't want kids to go through the trauma, the situations that we've gone through. And we want to make sure that when we leave this wormhole, that it is better for that next generation. So I really appreciate folks who challenge us. I'm always open to criticism. I like to tell folks that I come from a family of 14 children. My mother and father took no prisoners on us. So that's one of the reasons why I come to this with a sense of zeal and passion. And again, the thing that I learned in the Peace Corps is how it's very important to have unconditional love for people who do good things and to help people to achieve the best they can. So I hope that, again, as my colleague once says, when we leave these jobs, we leave our thumbprints there so they know that we were there. So again, thank you very much for participating. You know my neighborhood, you know how to catch up with me. And all you gotta do is send a letter to me and say, Jamal, and get to me like Ernie said that one time. Just send a letter to me.
We've got a couple questions that are coming in right here at the end, Jamal. We got a little bit of time. You want to address them?
Okay.
First one is, do you think the state is ready to accept responsibility for malpractice or fix what's wrong?
Wow. Do you think the state is ready to accept malpractice?
To accept responsibility for malpractice or fix what's wrong?
I don't know that for sure. I can't answer that because, again, I'm working for the county, and not that I'm trying to skirt the issue, as they would say, but I do know that a lot of folks I've run into have been able to get away with stuff they shouldn't be able to get away with. But I couldn't really answer if the state is going to accept that, except if I was a state worker and working with some of the folks who work in those administrative positions. Okay. But I understand where maybe the sentiment's coming of dealing with reparations and things like that. I think we're going to have to move in that area because I didn't think we'd ever take those Confederate symbols down until in recent years. So again, anything is possible. And in particular, if we come together collectively as society and push our will, I think it can change. Just like the smoking ban, the same thing.
Right. Can holding parents responsible for their children's behavior make an impact on juvenile crime?
You know, I learned this at Catholic charities, and particularly working in the food pantry with low-income families. They love their children as much as we love our children, whoever they are. And what we need to do is build a relationship and build a social capital, and be careful not to blame the victims, because sometimes people do better when they know better. And so I want to be very careful that oftentimes we put single moms in very awkward situations, and they're stressed out, or people who come from very difficult families. We got to be very careful with that, because yes, I think they can have some responsibility, but I think we got to be careful that we don't have that overreach and overpreach, and again, pull our sleeves up. One of the things I've learned even today, the best teacher is those who can show me, and someone who can actually get in the weeds and do what I have to do, if that's how we're going to learn. But yes, I want to be careful with that one, because I do think that it is hard to be a single parent. I tell the story, my wife had to go to Botswana for about a month or two, and I was a single parent for like 2 months, and that was only for 2 months. And the teacher called me up about something, and I almost flipped out. I was tired. You know, you work all day and you come home and you got to deal with 4 kids. You got a daughter, you got to do her hair. Man, I'm like, you got to be kidding. I was ready to fly my kids over there. But my point is, I've seen this trauma and this challenge that mothers and fathers deal with in our society. And I just think we got to wrap better services around parenting and help families in our community, because love is a universal thing. And we got to be careful not to stigmatize and point fingers at them when they may have some other mental health or challenges that we don't know about.
Okay, I think
All right. Well,
that's all the questions. Thanks.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it.
thank you all, Jamal, for your insight and experience. We really appreciate your presentation today. Folks, as we come to a close, there will be a 5-question survey that will pop up shortly. Please take a minute to answer the survey, as your feedback will assist us to improve our efforts in the work of RED. Although some of our conversations may be difficult, they are conversations that are necessary and needed to move the work of equality and justice for all. Again, thank you. And if you haven't downloaded the NJJA app for next month's training session, please do so. Next month, we will feature Rosie 2. Rosie is a refugee advocate with the Heartland Family Services here in Omaha. Rosie will assist attendees to begin to understand the culture when working with families and professionals from many refugees communities. Rosie will discuss family structure, views of education, government, as well as the importance of cultural connection for youth to navigate the two worlds. She will assist us in understanding barriers the system presents to this population. The webinar itself will address fears clients may have in working with system professionals. It will also enhance the professional understandings to refugee cultures to increase the ability for professionals to engage the families of that population. Again, thank you for your time today. And if you would, please fill out that survey.